Thank you, Amjad, for taking the time and joining me on the show today. It's a pleasure to have you on. You are the CEO of Replit. Previously spent some time at Facebook, and I think you were the first employee at Code Academy. And originally, you're from Jordan, so very interesting path. And recently, you guys raised your Series B, $80 million at $800 million valuation late 2021. So congratulations on that. Just amazing success in the last few years, I understand, with Replit. And looking forward to digging into it all. But before we get into it, for those who aren't familiar with Replit, or more importantly, for those who aren't familiar with you, would love to hear just sort of your background and how you got to where you are today and some of the decisions you made along the way.
Sure. Sounds good. Yeah, maybe I'll start with my background and then we'll make our way to Replit. I'm originally from Jordan, born and raised there. One of my earliest memories is actually my father getting us a computer, not even us, getting himself a computer. My father is an engineer. He was a low-level government engineer in Jordan. He's originally Palestinian immigrant, grew up in poverty, but his family kind of prized education above everything, and so he got a civil engineering degree. All his brothers were engineers and doctors and things like that. So he was always interested in technology, and when computers kind of became a thing, he was following it. And I think he took out a big loan to buy a very expensive computer at the time, probably, in the many thousands of dollars, and definitely above our means at the time. I was 6 years old, and I remember him kind of, starting up the computer. It was in this room that was like this, we had essentially like a three bedroom home. It was my family, two of my brothers, my mom and dad, and we had this extra room that was like sort of a playroom, but he put that computer there. And I remember watching him and his friend kind of unbox it, plug it in, and start it. And it was such a vivid memory to me. And I sort of looked behind their shoulders as they opened up this like really big manual. At the time when you buy a computer, that was like in the early 90s, you sort of have to learn how to program it, or have to learn at least how to do DOS commands. I think this was an IBM computer. It came with DOS, Microsoft DOS. And so they were like trying to learn how to use this thing. And for whatever reason, I like figured it out just by looking at them. And when he's done with it, I'll sneak in, or at night, like instead of going to bed, I will make it look like I'm in bed, but then I will sneak into that room where the computer is, and then I would start toying with the computer. And I knew how to create files, move files, even like open these small scripting files in DOS called bat files. Started coding those a little. And one day my father caught me, and he was mad at first, but then he was really surprised by how much I could do with the computer. I basically mastered kind of DOS by just trial and error and like watching him. And so that was very intriguing for them. And so they sort of were okay with it, that I would use the computer on my own. Later, I also figured out how to disassemble it and reassemble it. And my father once freaked out when he saw the computer disassembled. And I told him, no, don't worry about it. I can like put it back together. So it's something about computers kind of really sparked my attention. I always felt like I could think like a computer, or like I could actually understand how computers think. And I was like fascinated by technology. And I quickly became someone in the neighborhood or the extended family that could fix electronics, could fix computers. And that was like sort of my initial journey with computers. When I was 15, I built my first software business. It started from this need. I used to go to these LAN gaming centers and internet cafes. They were sort of all the rage in the late 90s, early 2000s in Jordan, because you couldn't really get internet at home. It was really expensive. And you would go to these places, you could play Counter-Strike with other people. And that was a lot of fun for me. One thing I noticed this where, they were managing these stores very manually with pen and paper. And they had all these people that were responsible for managing the store. It felt like it was very inefficient. And I sort of pitched them on this idea of like writing software that to create user accounts. And so that people, when they like buy hours, those go into their account. People can, accrue hours, build up an account and history, and you can have rewards around that. You can also provide accounting tools. You can know how much you made that day. You can project forward. And I sort of pitched them on this whole software management system. And they're like, yeah, that sounds really useful. Like we would pay for it. And I was like, all right, okay, I'll be back. And then it took two to 3 years to actually build it. So I sort of disappeared at home, and I was 12 at the time. I was coding in Visual Basic 4, and it took me 2 years to build it because there was a lot of challenging things around it. I had to learn what databases were. I had to do security work because you don't want people to have unlimited access to the computer. You want to be able to shut off the computer when they're done with their time, so on and so forth. But ultimately, it got it to market and was able to sell the software and the services. So I packaged it up with not only will give you the software, but we'll also manage your computers and format them and install games and do everything you like. And so I was 15 years old, and I started employing some of my friends doing that. I got a pager so that they page me. There was no cell phones in Jordan at the time, so that they would page me when there's a problem with it. And the software was really buggy. So they had a lot of problems, and I would get paged in school nonstop. And I would run away from school. I would literally jump out from the window to go fix my software and my services and my business. Eventually that sort of reached sort of a natural conclusion. I think software like it were kind of flooding the market. Piracy was a big thing in Jordan. Everything got pirated. I was kind of losing interest as well. And at the time, I was really excited about actually the future of AI. And I felt like, I don't know if I read some sci-fi or whatever it is, but at the time I felt like AI would eventually be able to write software. So I didn't feel like I should continue working on software. I should go learn something else. So I went into IT. I went into security for a while. I did all sorts of odd jobs around computers just to learn like the larger system. And went to university to study computer engineering. Eventually rediscovered my love for software, got back into software, and then immediately saw this huge problem facing me, which is I didn't have a laptop. Every time I went to go to class to learn a new programming language or new software thing, you would have to set up this really, you'd have to do this really obnoxious task, which is setting up your development environment. Installing a Java IDE, for example, installing Java libraries, downloading, gigabytes worth of software and data. And then, after you've done all of that, you write a program. God forbid you want to share that program. It's really hard to share it. You would send it as an email. Your friend who wants to run that program might be missing some libraries from the system. It was a very frustrating experience. And I thought, someone must be working on putting this all in the browser so you can share links around. Google Docs was becoming a thing. That's 2008, 2009. And I was like, what is the Google Docs of programming? And that was the kind of the germ of the idea of Replit, which took a lot of different twists and turns. Happy to go into it, but ultimately in 2016, it started the company Replit. And the idea behind Replit is you get a programming environment in seconds. Like you don't have to set up anything. You don't have to worry about anything. You just log into Replit, create a new REPL, create a new project, pick the language, whatever language you'd like. We literally have them all. And with one click, you have a programming environment. And not only that, say you want a package, we also auto install it for you. We'll detect what kind of packages you need. You share that program. The person you share the program with will get the exact same state that you left the program in. There's no ambiguity. There's no dependency problems. You can also share it in real time. You could code with other people that you just like you could do with Figma or Google Docs. And you can also host applications, and you can share to our community applications. Our community is full of applications that you can remix and get inspired by, and look at how people build things, fork, collaborate with other people. And ultimately, it's really Replit as three things. It's the programming interface, it's the infrastructure that runs all the programs and allows you to host your applications, and it's an exciting community of young creators like making things with software.
Great. Well, appreciate the story going back to the early days, and I certainly want to get to Replit and talk about Replit. But first, going back to the very beginning, you mentioned looking over your dad's shoulder at the computer. I understand it was like one of the first computers, not just for your family, but basically the first exposure you had to a computer anywhere around you.
Yes.
And you're looking over your dad's shoulder and his friends, and somehow figuring out how to do this thing. If you have any tips on like how you did that, or I mean, obviously you were 6 years old and you might not remember, but it's just interesting to hear that you were able to watch and seemingly so easily pick something up that there was really probably no resources at the time, or it just seems like a hard situation to learn that you were able to do as such a young kid. It's very interesting.
Yeah, well, I actually like, a lot of programmers who are my age have a similar experience because the difference between computers today and computers back then is computers back then sort of invited you to program them. Computers today are very opaque. The things that make computer usable for the average person also make them impenetrable for someone who wants to learn programming. Like, in the 80s, the machine that was like really popular in the US 80s and maybe 70s was the Commodore 64, and the Commodore 64 booted up to a BASIC interpreter, and it shipped with a book that can give you programs on how to learn BASIC. And so there's a sense in which computers back then were more inviting for programming, and kind of tinkering more so than today. And so while I agree, like my experience was like a little odd, just I think clicked for me in a way that maybe I had some innate talent that related to computers, but I think a lot of people have a similar experience because just the nature of having to learn programming in order to use a computer, unlike now where you can like use touch and mice and things like that.
So I'm curious, how have you taken this, the idea that it used to be much more inviting, and applied that to the Replit onboarding experience, which I found to be quite inviting?
Yeah, exactly. Like it is very much inspired by that. When you sign up to Replit, we make it as easy as possible. We ask you a few questions just to customize your experience, and then you basically, when you create your first project, it's just an editor. It's very simple. It's a file tree editor and a console. So what the console tells you is like, just give me commands and I will execute them. So we'll give you a few examples. You can look at the examples and click around a little bit, click at the examples, run some of the examples, and you start getting a hang of it, of like, oh, okay, right. So I input my code here, it runs over there. And so we give you a few videos, a few things to learn the environment, but basically we try to make it as intuitive as possible and as inviting as possible to program it. Like that's the first thing that you encounter. You come here to like write programs.
Right. So, I mean, we might jump between the story and present day with Replit a little bit, but I was reading your blog, and the reason I brought up that early story with your fathers, you mentioned that, I think this is like more or less a quote from one of your blog posts, that understanding and potentially stimulating the mind was what kept you interested, or sorry, not stimulating the mind, simulating the mind. This is the danger of taking notes, is what kept you interested in computers as a kid. And reading that struck me. It's like that's a pretty unusual perspective to have on like why you were playing with the computer for so long. You wanted
Yeah.
to understand and try to simulate the mind. What gave you the idea that that might even be possible? And how did it go exploring that as like a 6-year-old and upward?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I sort of started asking very deep philosophical questions at a very early age. Where do we come from? All right, okay, there's a God. Who made God? Like getting debates on the nature of the mind and human beings. Not exactly all when I was 6, but I immediately sort of understood that there's like a deep mystery that humans haven't really figured out. My parents did not know. My teachers did not know. The sheikh, which is the Muslim version of the priest, also did not know. Nobody had answers. Everyone was pretending to know things, but really nobody had answers about where we came from and sort of what is the nature of thought and the mind and things like that. And when I saw a computer and we started using a computer, it was like obviously a thinking machine. Like it was obviously a machine that was doing some form of thinking. Um, and that got me really curious because like even the interface, the DOS interface, which Replit has a similar interface, is a conversational interface. It's a chat box between you and this machine. You're giving it commands. It kind of thinks about the commands, evaluates them, and kind of responds to you. So actually, the name Replit comes from this concept: read, eval, print, loop. You're sitting there at a computer. The computer is reading your commands. It's evaluating them. It's printing them. It's telling you what it thought about, the conclusions it arrived at, and then it repeats the process. So that's what a REPL is. And to me, that's a fundamentally sort of somewhat anthropomorphic sort of thing that we gave the computer. The idea of resembling sort of commands resembling a conversation, just being like text, being like natural language, and being able to tell computers your desire, and for the computers to try to understand your desire. Your desires happen to be very logical mathematical things as a programmer, and then it executes those desires and kind of shows you an output. And the thread that throughout my life has been always coming back to this idea of like, can you teach computers to think? Can computers show us what makes humans humans? Can we understand the brain and the deepest concepts about the soul via exploring cognition and consciousness in the computer? And really, that's something that's always in the back of my mind. And it gets me really excited about the futures because not only will we be able to build amazing useful things, but I think in a way computers are somewhat of an exploration into what makes us us, because we've replicated this thinking thing outside of us.
Right. And so you mentioned like sort of falling away from software development for a bit because of this interest in AI and this belief that AI might take over software development, and you wanted to find something where you would be, like more useful for, where humans would be more useful for a longer period of time. but you sort of reverted back over time, rediscovered your interest in software development. And I think this sort of relates to the previous in a way, but you seem to have come to some conclusion that, AI, it might start replacing humans for various things, but that software development might be one of the last things to go. Could you walk through your progression from that sort of initial theory to, stepping away from software for a while and why you decided to come back, sort of realizing that maybe your earlier theory wasn't going to play out that way?
Yeah. So just thinking about the just projecting out from what I saw when I was like a teenager messing with software, creating software. Um, it just felt within reach that we can someday make the machine write the code. At the time, I didn't really appreciate how artful writing code is. I was mostly doing it for a specific goal to build certain applications. And I didn't see it as a fundamentally creative thing, although in retrospect it was obvious. But it just felt like, okay, computers are for automating things. Eventually, we'll be able to automate the act of automating things, which is software, right? Um, and I just started thinking, okay, like one day, there were already these software suites that would like generate a lot of code for you. We call it code scaffolding in programming. Click next. I want a project that does this, that has this database and whatever. And it asks you a few questions and it generates some starter code for you. We call them templates today, right? At Replit, we have a ton of templates for different languages and frameworks. But I was putting these things together. I'm like, yeah, one day you'll be able to sit down with a computer and go through a wizard and generate the application you'd want for any given use case. And that to me seemed pretty obvious that was going to happen. So I didn't see software as a potential career path. And by the way, a lot of people in the world at the time didn't really see. Software is now so pervasive, and software engineering is such a high-paying job that people forget that it's only recently people really understood how big that need is. But at the time, it just didn't feel like software engineering is going to be like the biggest thing ever. It felt to me that it was going to be automated. It felt like AI was sort of what was making a lot of progress. You're seeing in games, just seeing AI play games, and I used to play a lot of strategy games, and I felt like it was going to be there pretty soon. And so when I wanted to go to college, the obvious choice for me was software engineering, but I sort of resisted that choice because I wanted to learn something that would have more job security once AIs could write software. That's one part of motivation. The other motivation is the engineering association in Jordan did not recognize software as engineering. So I was like, okay, I know how to do this thing pretty well, but it's not very well respected. In the future, it'll be automated. I'll probably go learn something else. And the other thing I thought was like security was going to be a big thing. And it turned out to be a really big domain, because even if you had AI generating software, the security is still going to be a big concern, because hackers will still want to hack these like large software systems that will also still have flaws. I thought just like, what people call DevOps was going to be big, just IT operations at the time. And I wanted to learn that as well. So I learned all these things. And at the time, I think I started reading Hacker News, and particularly Paul Graham. And Paul Graham has written a lot on Lisp. I think he has this collection of blogs called On Lisp. And when you read those, I remember getting such a when you have an insight that you can like feel it in your body.
Hmm.
And I remember feeling like, reading Paul Graham's kind of Lisp essays and essays about programming languages, that I was like missing this whole thing about programming languages, design, and implementation, and how much art and how much human experience goes into these things, how much history there is there. And so that got me to dig into more programming language theory. And that got me really interested in programming again. And then just noticing how many different styles of programming language there is. Lisp, for example, is this fascinating language. Actually was born out of the MIT AI lab because they wanted a programming language that AIs can manipulate. And the idea was that code should also look like data. And Lisp is basically, it's called like Lisp programming. It's basically a collection of lists. So the program is made of lists so that the AI, whose software is the lists, could read its own software and manipulate it. And so the idea was to build something that can have this recursive aspect of it, of being able to self-modify. So that was the origin of Lisp, but it's also like a very beautiful language because you can build everything from small set of axioms, like the concept of a list, the concept of an empty list, and a few other concepts, and you can build a Turing complete language and system just from a few axioms. And by the way, that you see it all the time in sort of computers. You can build an entire computer from a NAND gate. Literally everything in the computer could be made out of NANDs. And this elegance has certain sort of something about it that's not purely mathematical or engineering. Something about it that's about beauty. And I think I noticed that then, is that there's this whole element that was missing about programming and programming languages, which is what makes them beautiful, what makes certain code artful, what makes certain programmers artists. And so, you read Paul Graham's book, Programmers and Painters, Hackers and Painters. And so I felt like there was this whole new world open to me about, programming being an art. And that's what got me into learning more programming languages and eventually going back to software.
And then if we can we bring that thread all the way forward to today on the AI element and, recent developments like GPT-3, how you view these things and how your thinking has continued to develop, and even, directly relating it to your business. You're teaching people, the goal is 1 billion coders from around the world, human coders, obviously. But there's this possibility maybe that still exists that AI can allow humans to operate at sort of a higher level where maybe some of these things won't become necessary. How do you think about where AI is going and sort of your latest thinking on it versus what you're building and focusing your, every day on?
Yeah. So everyone noticed that programming is really powerful. Software engineers are the most prized sort of labor category, and the most highly paid, the most highly sought after. And the other thing that people have noticed is that making software and making personal software and making computers do things that you want them to do is actually very useful even for the average individual. And so people have gone, like entrepreneurs have gone a different direction. There was this bubble around no code, which maybe we're still living in, but a bunch of people thought, okay, maybe you can create programming environments that are made of visual primitives. And actually, this is like maybe at the third or fourth bubble around these tools. There used to be called flow programming, and there was like this bubble around them in the 70s and 80s. And they keep coming back with different names. The latest rebrand is no code. But the idea in the air that you want to give tools to everyday people. And the other idea is that code can be very hard for people who don't want to spend a lot of time on it. And so the big question is like, how do you make it easier? Is no code the best approach to do that? What other ways you could make it easier? And I've always thought that code, not even code, just text as an interface is a perfect interface for describing computations. And I didn't feel like that was going to go away anywhere. I felt like maybe you could add some interfaces on top of it to make it easier. So with Replit, what we do is the text is basically the main interface that you're dealing with. So even when you're coding in Replit, say you want to start like a Django server, we actually detect that. We actually read your code and figure out your intent. I actually wrote a blog post recently called "Having Computers Computers Doing the Right Thing," and I talk about how like computers should try to detect user intent. And so Replit really takes us to the extreme. If you're trying to use a package that's not installed, we'll install it for you. If you're trying to open a port, we'll open a web view for you. If you're trying to do plotting, we'll open it. We'll show you the kind of visual output of the program, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of the detecting user intent. So we lowered the barrier for entry because you don't have to do a lot of these chores around programming. But what's left is the actual programming. You still have to learn that. And I think that's still tough for a lot of people in the world. I think most people will be able to learn it, especially starting young. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that everyone in the world would have to use it or would be using it. So the question is like, okay, what kind of interfaces on top of code that we can build? And so when I saw GPT-3, or actually scratch that, when I saw GPT-2 in 2018-19, I saw something that really was very interesting. For the first time, AI, ML, whatever you want to call it, is able to manipulate text in a very competent, almost human way. Like these transformer-based models do very complicated NLP tasks that they were not programmed to do. So you give them a couple examples. They call them one-shot learning. You have this model that was trained on a large corpus of data, and then you give it a couple of examples. Let's say you give it an example, like in English, we say hello. In Arabic, we say marhaba. So you type that out, and then you ask it. In English, we say goodbye, and you say Arabic, and then you ask the model to complete that statement. It will actually do that translation. It will complete that statement for you. And so you just taught this model to do Google-like translate in 5 minutes. You can teach GPT-3 to do translation in 5 minutes. So, okay, this is crazy, right? Like you can now take this thing that understands natural language on a very deep level and teach it to do complicated tasks in a matter of minutes. What else is like natural language? Actually, code is a lot like natural language. Like we kind of make the distinction between code and natural language as if they're two different things. But actually, there's a paper I remember reading in 2012. I think it was called "On the Naturalness of Software," and they do some data analysis on software. And software, the way we write code resembles actually how we type in English in a lot of ways. The frequency of things that we use and the tokens and things like that. And they apply some NLP techniques to programming, to code, and they actually get a lot of interesting results by just doing that. Like they train a very simple NLP model called Ngrams on code, and they realize that you can create an autocomplete widget using NLP techniques. So that was like a seminal paper that I think a lot of people kind of changed how people looked at code. And so when I saw GPT-2 with that mindset, I was like, okay, let's, can you apply it to code? GPT-2 was very limited. I think you could have sort of really hack it to try to apply it to code. But when GPT-3 came out, it was pretty obvious to me that you could actually make it like generate code and make it understand code and give you debugging tools and things like that. So GPT-3 not only can create code for you. So what you can do is you can like give it a human language prompt. Say, I want a React component that does X, Y, and Z, and will actually generate like the code. And a lot of times you just copy that code, you put it into Replit, and it will just work. And that's kind of fascinating. So now we have a machine that knows how to generate code, in some cases as good as a human. Now, there's a lot of limitations, like sometimes it doesn't understand context. Sometimes it totally hallucinates, it goes off track. So we're still early. There's a lot of engineering to do. There's a lot of research to do, but it has the potential to give us that higher level interface that I was talking about on top of code, which is basically English. Like you can just drive code using English. And now let's tie it back to what I talked about with regards to the conversational model of computing that, that the DOS had and the Replit has. Basically, I think the future of software is conversational. The future of software is one where you're having conversation with an environment like Replit to generate the software that you'd want it to generate.
Yeah, that's a really interesting overview. And I haven't really talked at such depth about someone who's been paying attention to AI for so long and sort of changing their thinking along the way. And it's just very interesting to hear the progression of all of that. Coming back to Replit, obviously one of the, the great selling points of the whole thing is that it just makes everything super simple and super easy. You log on, it's easy to start coding right away. You don't need to do any setup or anything like that. But I get the sense that the product itself, independent of the interface, but just sort of the business and the community and what it is somewhat complex in that it's not like a lot of existing things in a way. It's hard to categorize. It's not just like a simple tool. There's like a social network component. What do you think is interesting that most people don't understand about what you guys are building?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think when you're building something fundamentally new, there's this definition problem that you have, and then the thing becomes the definition, right? Like, what is Twitter? Twitter is Twitter. Like, when you say microblogging, like that doesn't mean anything to anyone anymore, right? And before Twitter was Twitter, there was no Twitter, and now we're thinking about building a new Twitter, and like there's a bunch of Twitter clones because Twitter invented a fundamental new way of doing social media, social networking, whatever you want to call it. And I think even Twitter, the company, is always struggling with figuring out what is Twitter. And so I think when you discover a certain modality, a way of interfacing with computers and the internet and software broadly, I think there's definitely always a definitional problem. So sometimes when we're pitching investors, the best thing we could compare ourselves to is GitHub. But GitHub is a network of static code, meaning the code is not running. You just store versions of the code there. You can collaborate on it. And there's a social networking angle there too. And GitHub, by the way, was not also straightforward to talk about then, but now we call them version control sites. That doesn't really capture what GitHub is. GitHub is a network of code and people. That's what GitHub is. So if GitHub is a network of code of people, what is Replit? Replit is a network of machines and people, because Replit is running the code. So it is running the code in these machines. And so Replit is a network of code. Replit is a network of people, but it's also a network of machines. And so in a lot of ways, Replit is kind of like the internet in that, like, we have all these computers running all this code, transacting in different ways. And, there are protocols that are running all these things. And then there's the programming interface, and the programming interface is kind of like what I explained what the REPL is, but it's also something new because we do a lot of things on top of REPLs that REPLs don't do. We're not an IDE because we don't have this like very heavy IDE is like what professional software programmers use, integrated development environment, and they're typically very heavy and industrial, and we're not like that. It's like more fun, lightweight. It does a lot of guessing for you. It captures user intent, and so there are all these ways where you can't really categorize Replit. And I think one more interesting thing about Replit, like the way I think my model for it is it's an operating system in the cloud, and I think at the limit that's really what we're building. Like most of the time we're thinking about how to deliver this computing experience over the cloud, how to run things on a cloud, run anything, run any app, any kind of application, and pipe it back to the client. And by the way, that could be any client. It could be your phone, it could be your tablet, it could be your e-fridge. So it's kind of like this new emergence, distributed cloud operating system is my mental model for it. It's not the best marketing sort of phrase, but that's how I sort of think about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I know that, like, obviously you guys target a very wide audience, and it's from the first time person learning how to program to someone, a student or teachers trying to help their students pick it up in a light way, in an easy way. But there's also this concept of being able to actually like build a business on Replit. Is that something that you think is going to become a larger part of what you guys are doing, where there sort of emerges this economy of businesses being built on Replit, and that could potentially become almost like a norm?
Yeah. So if you think about computing platforms in the past, so Bill Gates famously went to Zuck at Facebook, and Zuck was like pitching Facebook's platform, and Bill Gates, and maybe it's apocryphal, but people recount that meeting as like Bill Gates like, this is not a platform, this is dog shit. The one thing about a platform is that the economic value of the businesses and the software that's written on the platform and running on the platform exceeds that of the company. So the idea is that everything that's written and running and all these startups and all the applications that was running and all these software companies and all the value that's accruing in the user space in Windows exceeds that of the Microsoft ecosystem. Same with, or the Microsoft Corporation. Same with AWS. The AWS sort of larger ecosystem, the companies running on AWS, all of that, the economic value there exceeds that of AWS. So the Apple iOS, the economic value across all the apps exceeds that of Apple itself. At least that's Bill Gates' definition. And I think there's something to that. If you really are serious about building a computing platform, you need to be serious about supporting businesses. Those come hand in hand. So if Replit ever is something other than the toy, then we need to support real economic activity on the platform.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I'm certainly looking forward to seeing what develops on Replit and following your journey along the way. But I know we're coming up on time, so want to thank you, Amjad, again for coming on the show. It's been a super interesting conversation, and I could certainly run it back and do another hour, but I know you're a busy guy, so appreciate you taking the time, and wish you all the best with Replit. Where can people go to follow Replit and your journey and get started and everything like that?
I tweet a lot on Amasad, so AMASAD on Twitter, bunch of other places on the web. GitHub is the same. Replit, Amasad, and then my blog amasad.me. I think those two things are like the places where you would find me.